gen AI. So everyone says AI, AI, AI. I think the general consensus is that it feels very much in a bubble. But so I'm curious to see for an organization that pushes out AI a lot, what are some of the real practical use cases that you've seen out in the field?
Okay, so first of all, let me address your first question. Okay, I mean first comment. Okay, about it's in a bubble, and you're both right, and also, but also allow me to clarify, right? And so, for example, if I'm working with some of the Mosaic AI researchers, right? And we're talking top-notch researchers. They work with academia. Yeah, that's a whole bubble on its own, right? Yeah, I barely keep up with them, right? The type of research they do, that they dive into it. I'm barely able to talk about things like transform architecture, and they're going ahead and talking about, oh yes, let's do curriculum learning, let's do this, let's do that, right? And you're going, okay, cool. And the context is that, yeah, you're right, it's a bubble, and the industry itself is a bubble because they're constantly pushing things. Now, to your point exactly, so a lot of people will go ahead and say, yeah, yeah, it's in a bubble, so it's not real, right? And then I'm like, no, 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 it's quite real, right? Like, there's always the fear of not being involved, the FOMO, right? But the
Yeah.
reality is there already are things out there that use cases. Whether you're talking about, how people talk about RAG, like basic natural language interface against unstructured data. RAG is retrieval augmented generation, right? And then more recently, we've been talking about complex AI systems, right? These are real things that people are using, and or coding, natural language interface against structured data, where you're generating SQL, right? These are these are things that people are already doing and are being quite useful, right? It could be something as simple as get me a bunch of information, generate a really good looking blog for me, right? Um, I freely admit that I will use some tools, and what I do is I use my original writing as a source, so that way I can go ahead and generate like new writing. Now I don't publish it that way. Obviously, I use that as a starting point because basically I'm trying not to plagiarize myself, or right. So by using that context, right. But by the same token, right, is it more useful than just that, right? And that's where it's difficult to say, right? Because for a lot of enterprises, it's about getting their processes or their data right first before they're actually able to make use of these technologies. And but I'm trying to. It sounds like I'm trying to avoid the question, but I'm actually going to go
No, no,
back to it. But
I
yeah,
like your approach. It's good.
yeah, yeah. But but let me go back to an exact, like a real example. Like, for example, lots of people are using, GitHub Copilot, or they're using Databricks Genie, or Cursor's got a really cool IDE. What is it all the point? It's about code generation, right? And I like talking about code generation because it's one of the easier ways to explain it, which is, like, when you have an LM or Gen AI generate code, it's either right or wrong, right? I mean, it either works or it doesn't work. That's why it's actually one of the easier use cases to solve, because the whole point is, well, you can literally tell the LM to go ahead and actually now test the code too, not just simply generate code, but even test the code. And that's an example of a complex AI system, right? In other words, you're going saying, okay, I've got an LM. You've inputted a lot of code base. Great. That's awesome. So now I can generate code. I can generate a bunch of Rust code or Python code or SQL code or whatever. That's awesome. But then do I want to add an extra step, like, to validate the code works, right? That's where you start talking about agents, or start talking about complex AI systems. Or in case of Genie, using that example, right? Let's go ahead and look at the metadata in a Unity catalog, or look at our tables that are sitting, our Delta tables are, that hold the information. Can we now generate SQL code that's specific to your use case because of the tables and the metadata and the business logic that you have, right? These are where it's going beyond what the LM normally can do, right? So that's the key thing that I'd like to try to have people remember, is that you absolutely can make use of it, but it's not done in a vacuum. Now, there are companies that do things in a vacuum. For example, when Shutterstock created their image AI, which is basically this really cool image search, right? And I'm sorry, not image search, image generation, right? That's awesome. but they built that from scratch. But what did they do? They were using Databricks Mosaic AI to build it, but ultimately they still had all of their own images to begin with, right? That it started from there. They had a ton of their own images, and cool, we helped them pre-train their own model. Bam, they're up and running, so they got something brand new. Or 12th Labs, they went ahead and created this really cool video search, video capabilities as well. Like now, image video generation, not just image generation, right? Same idea. They pre-train it, but what do they start with? They start with really good data. So you can cover the whole gamut from something as straightforward as code generation, and you and I written code long enough to know that that's not even straightforward, okay? To basically pre-training a model from scratch, that has a specific set of use cases. And the reality is, it starts with you, number one, having the data and be able to organize and clean and understand the data you have, even if it's a small amount, to actually having a real business use case, right? And unless you've got those two things, you're right. Gen AI is actually not worthwhile. And that's usually the real problem, right? A lot of people talk about, oh, we can do all of these things. I'm like, well, can you be specific? Can you tell me what is it you're achieving, and how are you actually helping people with it? What's the value add that you actually provide that will say people want to say, hey, I want to pay for the service, or I want this additional functionality that I didn't have before, versus, cool, I can go ahead and generate memes. Like, don't get me wrong, that's cool too, but probably not as popular or not as important.